Now that cat is not being put there as a representative example of taking care of cats. But that cat is there as a display, as an accessory for the Financial Times' grotesquely, stupidly called How to Spend It. Now, the Financial Times entry that we have checked on the Wikipedia today, Saturday, 7th of November 2020, boasts that it is accessed by 20 million people worldwide. And as we have said, the corrupt kind of display of this so-called concern about the democracy movement in Thailand is completely untruthful and is corrupt and is not going to help the cause of democracy in Thailand, because the Financial Times is not concerned for democracy, and it's for it remains concerned for anti-democratic strategic interests and agendas and narratives, which is why billions of people in Asia and Africa are being forgotten and ignored by the Financial Times. Billions of people include hundreds of millions of people in poverty and in detention and denial and in displacement, and the most numbers of people currently and historically and for decades who have been made homeless and removed from their places and displaced are in Africa and Asia. And this week's little information about the racist crook Nicolas Sarkozy reviving his line that non-European migrants should be targeted for obstruction and denial of access and refuge in France and by France is typical of the agenda of these racists and democracy defiers and abusers. The Financial Times is edited now by a woman who is described as having been born in Lebanon. But the contents of the Financial Times don't reflect her recognition or her recognizing the reality of millions of hundreds of millions of people across the region and across Asia. And this cat, used as an accessory for a grotesquely offensive promotion of a menswear model or models, is again typical of the Financial Times' contempt for the truth. Any number of animals, generally, and cats in particular, are being murdered and massacred by recognized official kind of charitable outfits, non-profit outfits in the UK, across Europe, and across the rest of the world. There is no mention of that in that kind of abuse of the cat's picture. It's like using the kind of diversity tag. I mean, in the last few years in Britain and the Western kind of companies, and corporate organizations on the displays have started to show faces mostly of African people, either African men or African women, or African children. And at the point of entry into the portals of these big corporations, there are invariably pictures of African men or women or children. And we object to that diagnostically and evidentially because the actual policies and the actual behavior and the conduct by those corporations and corporate entities and organizations are very much opposite to what that display or that kind of display dishonestly is made to convey. They are not opposing their own internal day-to-day constant defiance of the human rights and the human values of African people in the internal, the day-to-day actual behavior. They're also denying access to other African people or people the type of whose image is kind of being exhibited by these corporations, corporate entities, including most of the UK government departments. They are obstructing, actively, proactively obstructing access to African people. And by definition, they are doing the same thing to people from Asian backgrounds. And the fact that Sarkozy has got the audacity and the gall to stage another attempted revival of his fortune, career's fortune, by targeting for denial of rights and access people, non-European people, shows that nothing has now kind of acknowledgement exists of the fact that there is racism and that racism is in contravention of most of the treaties and charters and conventions to which France remains a signatory. And the same applies to the UK. And in the case of the Financial Times, and this woman who is in the post of editor of the Financial Times, that is an extreme illustration of the lying and the corruption and the racism that is typified and denoted and connoted in those displays of Asian and African, mainly African, but sometimes there are some Asian people displayed at the portals of entrance to these sites. And this person who is in the post of editor of the Financial Times is a display item. She's there for display. The fact that she gets the display and gets the money to go with it is irrelevant to the actual reality of the world. And it's not Financial Times, it's a financial con. And it is a con that has been for 131 years, been in denial of the reality of poverty creation, imperialism, war trading, and denial of democracy and accountability in the UK, and by extension now to the rest of the world where the FT is accessed on the internet and online. The reason why we are talking about the exploitation of the cat in that picture, in how to spend it, is manifold. First of all, that thing called how to spend it is based on the corrupt and criminally cruel, contemptuous presumption that the reader, the FT reader, has it to spend it. That's the presumption. That's the ruling, running presumption. And that leaves out most people on the planet. Most people on the planet, on the average, cannot afford to spend £4 current price, £4 UK pound sterling for a copy of the Financial Times on Saturday to get hold of that, how to spend it. There is no way most people can afford it. Of course, there are people who can afford it. But we are talking about the majority, the many. The many that have existed long before Corbyn even left his primary school. I mean, this is the reality of the world. And the purpose of the diagnosis of Fleet Street is to identify the corruption and the contemptible, outrageous defiance of all the values that people have fought for centuries. And the Financial Times is in daily or in every kind of edition of it is in denial of that. And we are not talking even about the kind of latest results coming from across the Atlantic from the USA. We shall be doing that in a minute. Well, the Guardian is, of course, overdoing it, but they will do even more. They're saying that Kamala Harris makes history as first woman of color elected US Vice President. Well, that is the kind of display that they're doing, that they will be doing a lot of. Our focus is to look at the evidence. What will she be doing? Will she be representing the many, both of quote color and not of color, but there is color. White, of course, is part of color. But will she be representing all the people that kind of description kind of says that she is a member of, woman of color, woman and of color? The track record of Kamala Harris shows that she won't. If she does, then that would be absolutely, genuinely historic. And contextually, we point out that a year or so before Obama was actually confirmed as the candidate for the Democrats at the first election, we investigated his background as far as we could. And the records showed that he was a phony. Not at all in the way that the racist targeting of him by Trump has painted him to be. But we say substantially in substantial politics, quite apart from the trendy kind of bourgeois concern for the Medicare and Obamacare and all that, Obama actually represented and still represents the forces of empire, imperialism, war trading, and racism. And it is significant that Obama, in his interventions in the last few months in the election campaign for Joe Biden, focused on issues that had no relevance to the struggles of most people cast in poverty, pushed in poverty, and denial of rights in the USA and in other countries by the USA. USA state, USA kind of forces. So the coverage in the Fleet Street papers that have begun to turn on Trump is again artificial. It is not talking about the damage that Trump did. Damage that Trump did in every respect, in every category, every kind of aspect of power that he abused and applied while incumbent as the so-called president of the so-called USA. I say so-called president because he was never genuinely entitled to get elected or declared elected because he lied. And his lying got worse by the day, despite the fact that the Democratic Party failed to create a narrative against his lying on the evidence of his lying. And the fact that it's Biden and not Sanders sums it up, because the Democratic Party didn't want to put a candidate up like Bernie Sanders. Now, having said that, I have to say that Bernie Sanders doesn't come anywhere near the necessary requirements. He doesn't fill the requirements. But as compared to Joe Biden, he does meet a lot. So even with that limitation, the Democratic establishment didn't want somebody like Bernie Sanders to be president of the USA. Now, I'm not getting diverted into these Russian interference or Bernie Sanders' Russian kind of links, because those pale into insignificance as compared to the goings on within the USA and within the Senate. And the fact that the Democrats were robbed by Nixon, that was what, 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, has not been followed up by the Democrats demolishing the Republicans and everything that they represent in narrative. And that actually relies on the fact that politically they are not fundamentally different from the Republicans in terms of the main agenda, which easily can be said of the Labour Party in this country. In fact, the Labour Party in this country has been misled most of the times. And the Labour Party's so-called founding aims that are attributed to the likes of Keir Hardie have not been pursued with anything like the democratic vigor, the democratic kind of fervor, the democratic dedication, and the fact and evidence-based kind of campaigning. There is nothing locally, not in Tower Hamlets, not in next door Newham, not next door Hackney, or next door Islington, or next door Camden, or next door Southwark across the River Thames, or next door Lambeth down the river a bit. There has been nothing centrally, there is nothing regionally. And in the corruption called the mayor of London Post, there is, of course, total obstruction to democratic accountability by Sadiq Khan, as was the case with Boris Johnson, who was in place for 8 years. And before that, for 8 years, from 2000 to 2008, by Ken Livingston Livingston. So when we look at the Fleet Street newspapers of emptiness and lies, we also, in effect, look at the counterparts in the USA, in New York, and in Los Angeles and other places where the kind of, in terms of circulation, They publish leading papers, but they're empty. Despite the fact that there is a business and money related kind of rivalry between Jeff Bezos and Donald Trump, because Bezos, since he acquired the ownership of the Washington Post, has become clearly targeted by Trump, because of the contents of the Washington Post have included some truth about Trump, and even some of the truth Trump cannot live with. And despite the fact that there has been this rivalry and there has been this kind of tension, the Washington Post has not created anything remotely comparable to that one particular scoop or series of scoops that the Bernstein and Woodward, or Woodward and Bernstein, did against Nixon's theft. Because had the Democratic Party in the USA been opposed to the agenda of the Republicans and the agenda of the capitalist big business, and the agenda of the likes of Facebook and other big conglomerate robbers and looters, they would have actually given enough information to the current kind of crop of reporters and journalists on the Washington Post or the New York Times, but they haven't. I mean, the biggest thing that has hit Trump in the last 3 months, of course, is that one of the reporters from the Bernstein and Woodward's reports that have actually exposed Trump. It's not the Democratic Party. Woodward has done that, and the fact that it has been Woodward shows that for the last 50 years, no one else has surfaced to do the kind of rigor and rigorous investigative journalism. I mean, Woodward got more out of Trump in those conversations than any of the other so-called writers that have written about 100 books or so about Trump in the last 4 years. Of course, they have done tittle-tattle, and they have done a lot of sex and even incest about the suggestion in one of the, several books that Trump has been having incestuous relationship with his daughter, Ivanka. Even if that were the case, which a lot of indications suggest might be the case, that doesn't seem to have been linked to the unsuitability of Trump's political agenda for society. And of course, the Democrats have failed to kind of stop Trump as based on his incitement of hatred targeted against the Muslims, because that has been his biggest capital. So despite all the evidence that has been kind of publicly assembled and asserted against Trump, as I said, including his incest with his daughter, the Democratic Party have failed to kind of politically and democratically make a moral and legitimacy and ethical case linked with any of those. So when the papers are speculating today, Saturday, about the kind of difficulties that Biden would face because of the numbers in the Senate, I mean, that will be only part of the problems that Biden would face caused by the Republicans. The main problem is that Biden does not represent sufficiently democratic kind of agenda. And Biden doesn't have the personality kind of to convince people that he has any intention. I mean, the speech about uniting the states, uniting the country again, these are bland platitudes. When it comes to the real issues, real challenges caused by racist policing, racist judicial system, and the racist establishment, the racist business agenda, and the fact that there is inside the Black community of all backgrounds serious violations going on. It's like intra Black violence and criminality. Now, that has not been addressed, and that doesn't seem likely to be addressed. Kamala Harris, as we are saying at this point early on, will disappoint big time because it's in her makeup, it's in her character, in her record, in her orientation. So we shall obviously be looking back again in detail at Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. Now, returning to the scene in the UK, the fact that last week the lockdown was backed lock, stock, and barrel by Keir Starmer, as we pointed out earlier today, earlier on Saturday, that is the earlier kind of versions of or editions. The fact that Keir Starmer commanded or commandeered the Labour Party MPs to vote for Johnson was not unpredictable. And it is, in a democracy, almost allowable. But Keir Starmer didn't behave democratically, accountably. He did not cause Johnson to account to the Parliament for all the lack of facts that has been the case from the start of the surfacing of the virus 9-10 months ago. And that is the kind of trend that karma will kind of pursue. Starmer will pursue the agenda of complicity with the status quo, not holding the status quo to account, not stopping it and not reversing it, especially about the poverty creation and the starving of the poor children. We earlier pointed out that somebody saying that white working class boys need help was missing the point, because that actually assumes that the non-white, that is African and Asian boys or children, are getting preferential treatment, at least better treatment than the white working class, which is absolute lie, because the lack of the support that the children from poverty-stricken families and backgrounds need and deserve cannot be kind of divided along the lines of geographic kind of locations. In London, which is the biggest metropolitan kind of concentration in all of the UK, and one of the biggest in all of Western Europe, The deliberate creation of poverty and disadvantage is not accidental, it is planned. And it is part of the operation of the state and the operation of the kind of state power by the incumbent, whatever the political color was. And anyone who needs a fact check needs to look at Tony Blair. Because in terms of poverty creation, Tony Blair actually robbed the poor people of housing rights in a massive way. When he kind of put pressure on councils like Tower Hamlets to transfer housing stock, thousands of council-owned housing stock, over to gangs of criminals. Two of the gangs we have mentioned many times before. One, Popla Harka, and the other, THCH, that is Tower Hamlets Community Housing. These are gangster organizations. For example, the gangster Mike Tyrrell, who was a housing estate or housing manager in Tower Hamlets Council Housing Department, has been linked with gangsters in the Muslim named outfits in Tower Hamlets. And so Mike Tyrrell has impersonated himself as a Muslim or as a Muslim-friendly sort of guy. And he has received criminal collusion and collaboration from these so-called Muslim outfits. And what then happened was that the Muslim gangsters were used, have been used and are still being used to intimidate Muslim tenants and Muslim residents in the borough, where it suits the purposes of the criminals, either in Popla Harka or in the criminal Tower Hamlets community housing. And we come back to the question of the cat being exploited by the how to spend it corrupt outfit magazine called the what it says. It's What's New Pussycat. That is the headline. And the pussycat is there. The pussycat, of course, to people familiar with James Bond, this looks like one of the cats featured in one of the early James Bond films. Well, it's an exploitation of the cats. Now, on the streets of Tower Hamlets, on the streets of Newham, and on the streets of London generally, there are many cats in danger. And all the councils, all the local councils have got policies to treat cats as nuisance creatures. Now that is directly in violation of the legal obligations to protect and provide welfare to the cats. But that's not the case. That is not happening. As I have detailed previously many times, but I will do this just again as a reminder contextually. In 2001, in February 2001, a perfectly healthy cat was murdered in the Bethnal Green Road by a vehicle that passed while it was crossing the road. And that cat was very well looked after wherever its home was. So it was crossing the road, unaware that it would be murdered. When I found that cat lying on the spot in the middle of the Bethnal Green Road early in the morning, because I had been out feeding some of these cats in the vicinity of the Sainsbury's in Whitechapel. And I asked a man who was obviously employed by the Tesco Metro shop in Bethnal Green Road, near which this happened, what was he doing? And he gave me a blank look. So I rushed to my flat, and brought a towel, big towel, and I lifted the cat. And I took it home. And then while I was trying to work out where would be the best place to take it, I made inquiries of the nearest councils, which are Tar Hamlets and Hackney. And the short response from the councils was that they didn't care about cat safety. And they were anxious to say that cats didn't enjoy any protection from being murdered on the street by vehicles. Unlike dogs, they said that dogs did enjoy some kind of protection, but not cats. Now, this is a criminal culture that doesn't get reported by Fleet Street or the BBC or the other mainstream kind of media, either here or in the USA or in Western Europe. And all the evidence collected by people concerned about the welfare of animals, and in this context, welfare of cats, shows that any number of cats are murdered by the non-profit so-called organizations that are in place with public funding, allegedly to provide welfare and support and care for the cats. They don't. These non-profit outfits are part of the or parts of the front that collectively is maintained covering civil liberties, Citizens Advice Bureau, old age people, and all the others. All these non-profit big time organizations like Shelter about housing, all these big ones, not the smaller ones, but the big ones which get among them hundreds of millions of pounds of public money, both directly from members of the public and also from the state in various forms. All these outfits are engaged in massacre of the animals. And there is no way to protect the animals or safeguard them when these state-approved and state-authorized non-profit outfits are committing the murders and the massacres. So, like the kind of rest of the region near Lebanon, the Lebanon-born, quote, editor of the Financial Times is ignoring the reality of society and is not covering any aspect of society, especially not the welfare of the cats or the safety of the cats, nor indeed examining the lack of access to finance by the many in this country or in the other countries as well. So therefore, I said that this is a criminal insult and an outrage for the Financial Times magazine, FT magazine, to run this stupid piece that is not really for democracy about Thailand. And as I have said before, Thailand is treated by the Western visitors and tourists as a big brothel, as are some other neighboring countries as well. So the Financial Times is treating them with contemptuous kind of tokenism, because it's not really has got a record of questioning the massacres of the opponents and the kind of detention of the many protesters that have been taking place for decades. Remember, Financial Times boasts of being around for 131 years, long before Thailand was created in its current state form. The Financial Times is overlooking the genocidal state that the Philippines has been, because the overly dedicated Looney Tune, who is probably the world's only head of state, who has shamelessly praised all the crimes of Donald Trump and has been in return approved of by Donald Trump, who knows and has known, should have known, of the massacres that Duterte in Philippines has been committing. And so therefore, the Financial Times cannot have any excuse to pretend that it doesn't know what has been going on in the Philippines. It applies to the other Southeast Asian countries. All the countries, including Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, and other places, there are degrees of mass murders taking place, and Burma, of course. And the Financial Times has not done any in-depth analysis of the Burmese genocide of the Muslim Rohingyas. And it doesn't cover the state of the genocidal kind of agenda in Burma, which is very active, as fronted by A.S. Suki. And so therefore the Financial Times writing about democracy movement by the youths and the students in Thailand is a complete insult to the people who have been for decades murdered by the Thai repressive regimes. And the Financial Times exhibiting that cat on the front page as an illustration of the kind of feature about menswear models is showing contempt for the victims of massacres of the cats and the negligence of the cats and the attacks on the cats that include the attacks on the people's homes and housing rights. Suppose there are people being evicted or people who are subjected to the eviction procedures in the courts. There would be thousands of applications right now because Robert Jenrick has lifted the ban that he imposed under pressure and reluctantly on eviction proceedings, has not provided any statement, let alone any kind of support for the people who are being victimized by the weapon of eviction and weapon of homelessness. He has not provided any statement about the implications, the repercussions, the consequences and the costs suffered by the victims of evictions. Evictions are not just pieces of paper, and they do not just concern somebody physically walking on their own without any belongings. Evictions necessarily entail a person's entire life's possessions and their life's kind of connections and roots. So if the persons being evicted have a dog or a cat or more than one animal, that is never even mentioned. That is never even mentioned in the eviction procedures. Supposing that they were mentioned, would that mention or would those mentions guarantee any support or protection or compassionate, kindly treatment and care of the animals affected by the evictions? The answer is no. So we go back to the question of the blitzkrieg in Brick Lane carried out between July 2012 and October 2012. Although the actual kind of physical attacks took place up to the end of August and the beginning of part of the month of September 2012, the physical repercussions continued in a big way up to October. And the attackers targeted the kitten's house. Now, a word of updated kind of description about the kitten's house. The kitten's house was the house of the 3 kittens and also the house of the main kind of contents of the archives that had been again forced out of the flat in London E2 by Mike Tyrrell and Tower Hamlets Community Housing. So the kitten's house was the kitten's house plus a unique world action collection of materials that contain the widest varieties of authoring kind of devices, contents, and kind of manuscripts and works underway. And the attacks were given a completely false appearance of legitimacy by the involvement of the criminals in posts in Tower Hamlets Council, whose conspiracy included the plot to cause harm to the 3 kittens. So all of these details will be, of course, itemized and broadcast and published in updated forms. And they conspired with the other criminals involved in the attacks. And Luther Rahman was being told to stop these council employees. And Luther Rahman knew the facts and he failed, but he lied because the messages he gave in return through Alibor Chaudhry were in conflict and odds with what he was actually doing. The messages showed that he was doing as he was being asked by me to do, to stop them. And he needed time, he said, but he was lying. So this happened at the addresses because the kitten's house was behind the building, numbered between 160 to 164, and then from 164 to 170 Brick Lane. In between, there are other numbers that are not connected with the particular kind of gang of criminals, but they are connected in terms of the plot. And we shall separate those things. There is a film that I recorded on the 15th of February 2011. It's about a minute. It has been on YouTube since that date. And the film contains my filming Luther Rahman and 2 others walking the same distance in the main Brick Lane, distance between 164 to 170 Brick Lane. And before that film, about 2 hours previously, I had spoken to Lutfur Rahman as he was getting out of the hired kind of minicab or hired cab that had its meter running. So it could have been a taxi, but not a black taxi marked in that way. And I told Lutfur Rahman in the first conversation on the 15th of February 2011 that Tower Hamlets Council was engaged in causing serious damages that would be totally physically replaceable and beyond description. And Lutfur Rahman promised to do it, to stop them. And he said to me to talk to him on the telephone. When I tried to talk to him on the telephone, I didn't get hold of him. That was one of his MOs, if you like, modus operandi. He would give a plastic expression of being kind of submissive and poisonously plot to do the opposite of what he was promising. Now, what I was talking to Lutfur Rahman to stop entailed very serious materials as well as persons and personal kind of welfare and safety, as I said. One was a woman stranded in Bangladesh, and one a group of children. Now, in case I haven't mentioned this before, these children were not just children separated from the parents. They were orphans. So it can be imagined just how desperate it was that Lutfur Rahman did not stall or refused to stop the criminals in the council that were adding additional dangers to the cats and kittens and to these women stranded in Bangladesh and to these orphan children. All of that linked with myself because I was the nearest person and the only person that could organize support for the woman and organize some kind of rescue for the children and organize the protection of the kittens, as well as protect the unique archives and action libraries that were being attacked. Now, anyone who has got any understanding of general concepts that I have been talking about should need no extra tuition to understand the terms that I've used. And I've used terms and I've used expressions and I've used references intentionally being brief, because the actual details of each of the perpetrations and crimes that Lutfur Rahman was complicit in the perpetration of. He was complicit because he knows every time he knew what was going on because I kept communicating with him because he was in post and I asked him to do the right thing and he didn't do the right thing. And if he didn't do the right thing, in terms of the local framework, there was no other kind of local kind of agency that could get involved because the council would then obstruct anyone getting involved or deny, which is what has happened, which is what is happening now, which is what has been happening through Tower Hamlets Council for decades, which is why I remain opposed to Tower Hamlets Council being lumbered with an elected mayor. That is to say, an individual who is not subject to rigorous democratic and daily and transparent accountability. And there is no such culture in Tower Hamlets among the Labour Party members, who are the likeliest ones to have a candidate that would succeed in getting installed as elected mayor. There is no culture in the history of Tower Hamlets Labour Party. In fact, the Tower Hamlets Labour Party has been so corrupt that it was under so-called special measures by the Labour Party centrally, or London Labour Party. And despite the fact that it was put on special measures, nothing changed for the better. Nothing kind of replaced the corruption, the criminality, and the negligence and the cruelty and the contempt for ordinary values of safety, welfare, kindness, and compassion that Tower Hamlets Council exhibits and exhibited and has been exhibiting. So this is how the Financial Times is being diagnosed. Remember, it has got an exhibit on the front page of the How to Spend It grotesqueness of a magazine, a picture of a cat that looks kind of okay. And it gives the suggestion that the Financial Times magazine is about cats, or at least substantially so it's not. It is quite literally using that cat picture instead of a picture of a murdered cat or something. That's the difference. So it's actually abusing the cat or the cats. When I was engaged in the campaign against Tower Hamlets Council in an earlier kind of period, I was talking to a Financial Times reporter after he published some kind of report. I'm talking about the 1980s. He published some kind of report about the poverty of the East End. It was a token report, but it was a report that referred to poverty. And I called him, and I then got him to come to the place in New Road, London E1 1HE. And I organized a meal for him so that we could have a kind of conversation while having a meal instead of going to a restaurant. And in the conversation, he promised to kind of respond to any written kind of evidence that I would submit, and he promised to publish the stuff. He agreed that what I was telling him about what was going on the ground was news to him, because he didn't know any of this. Well, that is not new, because he not only him, no other reporter would know that either, because they're not engaged in the kind of fact-based, evidence-based, round-the-clock action that I have been engaged in. So that they would not be kind of able to access the information and the evidence that I had access to and I had knowledge of. And the Financial Times man broke his word. Now I'm talking about the 1980s now. This is 90s, and this is now more than 30 years ago. And if I kind of check hard, I may come across the name again of this man. He's no longer shown as a byliner, so I'm sure he must have retired or left or something. But essentially, what he was doing was a one-off. The fact that he actually visited the address in London E1 was one-off, just like ITB's Peston. I got him to come and see me in New Road about a campaign that I was at that stage running about education and racism. And Peston took the evidence and gave me the undertaking. He was working for the Times at the time, Murdoch's Times. And he said he would cover it. Now, the basic kind of standard way of fact checking is that if you get information like I was giving them and they couldn't corroborate the authenticity or the veracity of the evidence that I gave them, they could check with some other source and they could double check with me. They could ask me to provide corroboration and whatever, but they didn't do any of that. And I have been practicing these values and these standards for decades, since long before Peston surfaced as a journalist on the Murdoch Times. So what the Fleet Street papers and the media mainstream in this country do is operate the agenda of being actively in denial. That is one. And secondly, they are, for whatever reason, because none of them ever says to me that they are kind of failing to take forward what I'm telling them is the fact because of any racism on their part. They never said that, of course. And none of the racists in Fleet Street or in the kind of broadcasting counterparts has ever said that they are being racist, but they have been racist. So what evidence I give, if it is unique, genuinely, objectively unique, in the sense that nobody else has done the research, done the work, done the kind of investigation anywhere, and if the kind of transparency standard, the morality standard, the factual standard, the ethical standards that I practice are above and beyond anything that is found in the behavior of the existing media, then on logical, evidential, universal standards, my work would qualify to be recognized in terms of the action. It's something completely different from my kind of suggesting that I should be given money or a kind of payment or something. I'm talking about the issues, the agenda, the evidence, and the cruelty done to the animals and the cats, and the cruelty of treatment meted out by the London Hospital, Royal London Hospital, by initiating a mass eviction of the tenants in the properties in 1987 by putting those properties on auction. These are known facts. Yet there were 2 or 3 local titles in the 1980s. There were no internet, so therefore the printed papers were the news sources for the local areas. And none of them covered any of this. And none of the papers which, the papers, there is only one left now, is called the East London Idiotizer, Docklands and Tower Hamlets Recorder or something, or Docklands and East London Advertiser. They knew the wrongs that were taking place and they never covered. In fact, the East London Idiotizer claims to have been around since the 1860s. Well, if that is the case, which factually it is, then how did they miss the whole degeneration of Tower Hamlets and East London by the imposition of Canary Wharf and the creation of the no tax paying kind of zone by Michael Heseltine for the Tories. Because the Docklands development took place by exempting the developers from the major liability to pay taxes. And effectively, there was no real planning regime. So the local papers, as well as the main Fleet Street, completely ignored what happened in the Docklands under the Tories, and as did the Labour Party. So anyone who says that Corbyn is the kind of most sincere socialist that the Labour Party was stupid to not have as leader. Corbyn was very much an MP throughout the major part of the decade with the 1980s, because he got in either 81 or 82. Whenever he got in, Corbyn failed to make a case, make a stand. And I said that on the record, and anyone can check that. If they can find any evidence that what I'm saying is not including evidence of Corbyn's behavior in defense of the Isle of Dogs and the East End of London, they can provide me with that evidence and I shall update accordingly my commentary. But the essential narrative is my assertion that Corbyn always has been quite incapable of understanding most of the stuff. And this is one area that kind of summarizes and sums up Corbyn's irrelevance. Corbyn surfaced at the York Hall in Bethnal Green on at least 2 or 3 occasions that I witnessed. And Corbyn was given a space and the time because he was an MP. And the organizers of the the events, invariably were kind of the same kind of people like the Socialist W Party. And Corbyn spewed sympathetic words about the Palestinians. But Corbyn didn't make sense, because Corbyn could have been reading from a script handed down to him by the supporters of the oppressors of the Palestinian people, and he wouldn't know the difference. And in the last 5 years that Corbyn has been at the front of the Labour Party in Parliament, he has failed. He has failed to engage with the issues, engage on the issues, and engage with the many, despite the fact that he left the post. He was replaced by Starmer not long after the year that saw Corbyn mouthing this slogan, for the many, not the few. Corbyn has not connected himself with the many. And that includes the very serious issue of the councils being cruel. And Corbyn has not made any intervention to protect animals and to stop the criminal behavior by council cliques and criminals which attack the housing human rights of people with animals and other kind of liabilities and obligations and responsibilities. So Corbyn may be the kind of symbol for those people who are still convinced that he was better than Starmer. He may have been better than Starmer in terms of slogans, some of these slogans. But essentially, Corbyn did not provide a complete narrative and complete alternative and complete kind of answer to the dim-witted agenda that Starmer is pushing. And Corbyn did not make the council accountable, councillors accountable, council employees accountable, nor indeed the hundreds of thousands of decision makers in the name of the NHS that actually defy the rights of the targets of their wrong decisions. So what I'm saying is that there is nothing in the mainstream agendas of either the Labour Party, no more certainly not the Conservative Party, or of the Greens, so-called, whatever the numbers, and the Lib Dems. Of course, they are more right-wing than the Conservatives. There is nothing in the known kind of plans for society peddled by any of these parties that actually take care of the lack of care that is the dominant culture and the theme. So we shall be continuing in the next one accordingly.